I'm so excited to share with you today an interview that I did with my teacher, my mentor, Dr. David Norris. And we are speaking about a very, very important topic, particularly now, of where we are as a species in the world. We are speaking on the topic of what it really means to be living beyond the story. And he is by far one of the most knowledgeable and wisest teachers I have ever been honored enough to learn from. David has led maturation programs all over the world for 50 years. He has worked with every possible kind of human being from all cultures. The three greatest takeaways that you will get from this video is learning the difference between surviving your life and truly living it. The second biggest takeaway is really learning what is this thing called your story, this character that we identify ourselves with, and how it is creating your reality. What you think is your life and is just fixed is in fact a mirror of where you're coming from and the stories in which you have been identifying with, and how we might actually begin to start becoming free of this and living with more freedom to who we truly are. And the third biggest takeaway is really starting to understand why your repeated patterns are playing out over and over again. So I hope that you find this as valuable and useful and rich as I have. So enjoy this video. Please do write in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know how it impacts you. Let me know whether you have any big insights. I want to hear from you and I will be writing back. And please do subscribe to Soul Surgery to support this great work and spread it out into the world to as many of you as possible. Good morning, David. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to me and speaking to my viewers on Soul Surgery this morning. I must admit, I'm nervous speaking to my own teacher and my mentor. There's a part of me that wants to get this right and to be good. And I think that's also an important part of the conversation that might come up over the next hour. But I know that a lot of people who follow me and who are interested in my work have heard a lot about you. I speak a lot about my teacher, where I learn things from, and then I pass them on to them. So I know a lot of people are looking forward to watching this interview and learning from it. So first, I'd love to give you the opportunity just to share a little bit about your experience and where you've come from and who you are and how you've come into this work yourself. So over to you. Would you share that with us?
Sure. Well, thank you, Nicky. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm also not quite sure what and how I'm going to say what I'm going to say, but well, here goes. First, a little bit about me. And by the way, I've made some notes for myself about what we're going to talk about. So if I look down every once in a while, it's just because I want to make sure I include everything I had in mind. Okay, so about me. My background. I began my professional work life as a college teacher. I have a PhD from Columbia University in New York in English and comparative literature. And then I became an assistant professor at the City College of New York. And then I left academia and started working for an international adult education company, which gave me the opportunity to travel worldwide, and I did. I've led courses and programs and worked with people in the United States and Canada, of course, Australia, India, most of Western Europe, and parts of the Middle East. And that gave me the opportunity to come into contact with many different cultures. And that's important in the work I do and really where I come from, which is why I mention it. Um, I'm now married to Brigitte. Brigitte is my wife. We live we have a home in Germany. I have a home in the United States as well. Spend a lot of time in Germany. So I'm familiar with different cultures. And again, that'll be an important point, I think. So to kind of sum up what I think is important about my background and relevant to the conversation we're having today is two things. First of all, I consider myself an educator. I always have. The only thing that changed over the years, and it's been almost 50 years now of my professional work life, the one consistent thing I would say in all of those 50 years is the fact that I consider myself an educator. And the only thing that's changed is the venue where I participated with people in a process of education. The other thing, which weaves its way through my background as a theme, is what I mentioned just a few moments ago, and that is culture. Yes, there are many different national cultures, and I've had the opportunity to work with people in many different national cultures. But there's also the culture of human being. Now, normally we don't think of human being as a culture. I mean, it's a species, not a culture, but actually it is a culture. And the same basic principles with which one can deal with cultures, national cultures, one can also apply to the culture of our species, which is to say, a whole set of perhaps unconscious and unexamined assumptions about the way the world is and about the way one lives in the way the world is. And those unexamined assumptions is what I like to address. It's the nature of I call the work I do maturation, maturing. The maturing process, to my way of thinking, has to do with being able to penetrate the invisibility of our assumptions, making them visible enough so that we're not automatically driven by them, which opens up a whole other possibility of freedom in one's relationship to living. So that's my background.
I mean, I find that absolutely fascinating to hear that being a human being in itself is a culture, or what we perceive as being in a human being and how we live in life as a culture. And, you know, like you said, that comes to the topic of today's interview and conversation is we're going to discuss what it really means to live beyond the story. And I think that, you know, the word story gets thrown around a lot at the moment, particularly in the industry that I'm working in wellness and in healing industries of, you know, that's your story. You can change your story, rewrite your story. But I'm not entirely sure when I hear it thrown around like that, that there's a real context of what that means. And so I would love to hear from you. What does it mean to live beyond the story? What does it mean to you?
Yes, what does it mean to me? Well, there's three key words in this topic: living, beyond, and story. And the best way I can think of to answer that question, which of course is the relevant question, is to take each of those three words and try to gain a depth of understanding, because I think together that will paint the kind of picture that'll make sense in terms of illustrating what kind of work it is that I do.
Sure.
Let's start with living. um, Most human beings, most of us, aren't really living. We're surviving. And if you look at the word surviving, it comes from the French sur, which means on or above, and vivre, to live. In German, the word is überleben. Same thing. It's Leben means living, and über means above. Now, it doesn't mean above like better than or higher than. It means somehow removed from, separate from. And that is what surviving is. It's a way of being that is somehow removed from or separated from living. And what I understand under living is to be in the presence of your experience of life. That's what living is, in my view. What surviving is, in my view, is being in the story about living, being in the story about life. So it's the difference between being in the presence of living and being in a story about living. Um, so that's the first thing to say about it.
I just wanted to add into that is it seems as if, certainly I've learned this about myself, is we think we're living, when you talk about living as being in the presence of the human, of the experience of life.
Yes.
Most of us are trying to find ways to either fix the experience, get away from the experience, or change
Exactly.
the experience rather than being with it or being
Yes.
aware of it.
Yes. Well, you're introducing a very important principle. It's being with as opposed to trying to do something with. It's the
Yes.
difference between doing and being. We're constantly trying to do things with our experience so that we can have a different experience. Because everybody, one of the basic premises of a story is that there's some happy end that we're striving for.
Yes.
And we have that picture in mind. So having, again, we have a picture in mind of how the story is supposed to turn out. And we do everything we can, including resisting the circumstances as they are, in order to one day have that happy ending. So
Yes.
there's a dynamic set up inherent in what a story is. You know, I'm here, whatever we mean by right now, present, and the circumstances are the way they are, and almost always, at least to some degree, they're not the way I'd like them to be because I have a picture of a future in mind. And
Yes.
the striving for that future and doing whatever I have to with the current circumstances, resisting them, trying to change them, trying to fix them, is what fuels and drives the story. And most people, certainly as they get older, most people have probably recognized that somehow the names change, the faces change, the employer changes, the city where you live changes, the country where you live sometimes changes, but somehow the basic experience of waking up every morning into your life remains the same. Because
Yes.
the more you resist the circumstances, the more they persist in a different form.
Yes.
Um, and that's the nature of a story.
Yes.
Now, the other fundamental nature of story is that there's always a main character. And the name of my main character, of course, is me. I'm the main character of my story. I was born there. I had those parents. I grew up in that city. I had those friends. I went to that school. I got that job. I had those circumstances, married that person, perhaps had that divorce, had those children, and so on and so on and so on. And so we tell ourselves a story, the main character of which is the one we know of as me.
Yes.
Now, let me say something about me because that's also fundamental to the nature of story. What is this phenomenon called me? Well, if you ask most people, it's the one they have in mind, and they usually point at their own head when they say the one I had in mind, because we somehow have this naive idea that there's a me inside here someplace. And what that me actually is a thought I have about there being someone inside here that is thinking thoughts.
Yes.
So let's look at that thought that I have that there's a me thinking thoughts. When you wake up in the morning, when anyone wakes up in the morning, we don't run to the bathroom mirror to find out who's there. Um, no, we go to the bathroom mirror in the morning already knowing who's going to be waiting for us. So that already knowing is being in the presence of the one that you are referring to as me, and then the image in the mirror merely confirms what you already knew.
Yes.
Now, that one that's waiting for you in the bathroom mirror, where does that come from? Well,
Yes.
It comes from your thoughts, which are lodged in memory. So, in other words, this phenomenon that we refer to when we think of ourselves, when we think of me, who is the main character of the story, this phenomenon is based in the past. It's a past-based phenomenon. And knowing ourselves as this past-based phenomenon, looking, so to speak, through this past-based phenomenon's eyes, looking at the world through me's eyes,
Yes.
the world that appears for me keeps being based on where me is looking from, which is the past,
Yes.
which is how come the present keeps repeating itself in different forms. We
Yes.
keep living in a world story. We keep living in a story which somehow has problems weaving their way through it. And these problems are really always repetitive, not all the time, but most of the important ones in relationships, regarding work, regarding sex, regarding money, regarding the things that are important for most human beings. There's often, in most of those areas, a repeating pattern.
Yes.
And the reason it's repeating is because the one who's living that life is the me, which is based in the past.
Yes.
So that's the other important feature of
I'd,
story.
I'd like to add to that because as you were speaking, it made me think back to a recent experience that I went through in my marriage, where, after 9 years of being together, my husband and I found ourselves just having the same fight over and over and over and over again. And it was like
Yes.
we kept trying to change, maybe if we speak like this, or maybe if we change our routine, or
Right.
maybe if I fix this, or maybe if I fix this in myself, then this will stop this dynamic that kept playing out. But nothing ever seemed to change it. And as you know, we separated. A lot of my followers know that we separated. And one of the biggest things I saw very quickly after separating was I was so consumed with this picture that I wanted, that I thought me should be living, and that would be me in a marriage and a life,
Right.
that I had this picture of what marriage was, and I had this picture of me in a happy marriage was.
Exactly.
But the picture consumed me so much that I never really ever saw my husband. And I
Correct.
wasn't able to actually see him and
Yes.
see what was occurring in the moment. The picture itself was what was living our marriage. My picture
Right.
was living my version of our marriage. And in that picture was a me. And in the dynamic that kept playing out it was just an absolute perfect repeat of the dynamic that would happen in my childhood.
Exactly. Exactly. And when you put two people, two me's, in a box called relationship,
Yes.
and each one trying to do what they think is right to achieve the picture of the happy end, you get the frustrating repeating patterns. That's exactly the source of it. With the best of intentions, two well-meaning, honest, trying their best human beings trapped in what seems like an insoluble paradox of no way out, even though we love each other and we each honestly mean the best.
Yes.
Uh, so let's look for something else we might do. Let's go
Yes.
talk to somebody who might tell us what we can do. Let's go read a book that might tell us what we can do. And so it remains in the doing and the doing and the having domains.
Yes.
And maturation is really a shift from the doing and having domains to the being domain, which
Yes.
brings us to the last word
Mm.
in the three words. So the first word was living, and the second word was story that we're working on. I think you see that most people are not living, they're surviving. And what surviving means is to be trapped as a me in a story. That's what
Yes.
surviving looks like. And it shows up as repeating patterns.
Yeah, and I just want to add, just before we go on to the last word, I'd like to add just one more possible example, just so that the people who are watching this will have even more identification. You know, a lot of people might find themselves, maybe they'll change their jobs, or they'll
Right.
change the shape of their bodies, or they'll change their partner, or they'll change the outside circumstances, thinking, if I could just get this,
Right.
if I could just change this, well then I'll stop feeling not enough, or then I'll
Exactly.
stop feeling unworthy, or then I'll stop feeling this feeling of unsatisfaction that I constantly have.
Right.
But then, it's like we get on a hamster wheel. There's never enough things to change, and yet
Exactly.
we'll come back to the same thing, the same.
Because because no matter how many times you change your circumstances, you always bring me along.
It's that whole thing of, oh, if I could just go to the Bahamas, and I'll say, well, when you
Yeah.
get to the Bahamas, you'll still be there.
Exactly. Exactly. And people understand that when you tell them. They even laugh at it when you tell them, and then
Mm.
they go out and do it again because we can't imagine another alternative.
Yes, because we can't really see, if we're still coming from the me, the idea of who we think the me is, which is the
Right.
character in the story, then whatever we see from that place will be colored by the story itself.
Right.
And that's the hamster wheel, isn't it? And that is
Right.
surviving. I always say, surviving is not about living. Surviving is about not dying. It's about, we're
Right.
just trying to get by,
Right.
and we're missing the life in between, or we don't quite know how to be in the life in
And
between.
exactly there is where beyond begins.
Mm.
Um, um, how do you get to what we're missing, to use your words? So let's talk about beyond. We have living and story, and there's no living inside a story, there's only surviving.
Mhm.
So, what does it mean to live beyond the story? Well, the first thing we have to say is that's actually a misnomer. You can't ever get beyond the story because the story is everything you know. It's the reality that you know of is your story. It includes everything that you know of. And if you should happen to discover something new, that will immediately become part of your story.
Yes.
So to say living beyond the story is not to, I don't mean by that outside of the story, because there is nothing outside of the story. There's only the story. To live beyond the story is to recognize the story as a story,
Mm.
and not just intellectually, conceptually, by understanding that, which is not so difficult for people to do, but at a much deeper experiential level, to be in the presence of the story as a story. And when you do that, something shifts
Yes.
in your relationship to the story. So it's not that you get out of the story. You have the same story. You're still married to the same husband. You're still living in the same house. You still have the same children. Your circumstances remain the same, unless, of
Yes.
course, you change them. But then they are the circumstances you then have. But it's not about changing the circumstances. It's about an alteration in your relationship to them, a relationship to them which allows you to be with the story as a
Yes.
story, which begins the moment you're able to recognize the story as a story. And so you've made a shift in domain from doing and having to being with. And then suddenly, the very same circumstances, your story, there's a shift in your relationship to it such that it doesn't seem quite so fixed anymore. It seems more malleable, more open, more
Mm.
flexible. And suddenly there are pathways of action which did not appear before, which allow you to deal with the circumstances, the very same circumstances, in new and different ways that lead to new and different outcomes.
Yes. There's a few questions that come out of what you've just said. Firstly, when you said about um, getting an understanding that it's a story is one aspect of it, but then we need to go deeper. And I think
Right,
that's essentially what's talked about a lot more commonly, is about this thing called mindset. Oh, I see that I have this belief system, or I see that
right,
I understand that I have this story, I'm not worthy.
right,
but understanding it is not enough to be able to have a different relationship with it. And so a lot of people might try and do something with that understanding. They might,
Right.
50 affirmations every day. I am enough, I am enough, I am enough. But the understanding of it doesn't change your relationship to it.
Right.
You just have an understanding of it. Now, what then I hear you say is that when we go deeper, really the first step is gaining a real awareness and also almost like an observing of the story itself as an experience and as it's playing out. Like I've heard often, once we have awareness and we are able to observe it, we're no longer completely consumed in it. Is that the same thing as what you're saying?
It is, except so far, as far as we've come, is a very good explanation of it.
Yes.
So we have done a good job of explaining it, but we are merely at the beginning of being able to pierce to the level where it would make any difference.
Yes.
The example, if I can use an example here, it's a favorite of mine. Um, when I was quite young and I had not yet learned how to ride a bicycle, I had a tricycle, but I didn't have yet a bicycle. And I do remember this because it made an impression on me. I saw the older kids riding on their two-wheelers, on their bicycles. And I asked one of them, how do you do that? Because it puzzled me. I didn't understand it. And he said, oh, balance. Now, balance was the correct answer. It was good information. But you can't ride a bicycle with good information. Then finally, when I did get older and I had my own bicycle, it was a gift from my aunt. I remember that too. And I remember being on that bicycle, and I think I fell learning to ride, and I think I fell once or twice. And then there was this moment, oh, balance. Oh, why didn't you say so? Well, of course, they had said so, but the domain in which I was listening was the conceptual information domain, the domain of understanding and explanation. And the information was correct. But you cannot ride a bicycle with good information. You need an opening. You need a different relationship to your experience of reality for there to be an opening for new kinds of action.
Yes.
And that's what we're talking about. So and that only comes from being able to be with the circumstances as opposed to doing something with them so as to have a different set of circumstances.
Yes. Yeah, I think back again to after I separated from Kevin, there was a moment when we were in a conversation again, which potentially could have done exactly the same as what it had always done, which we would get escalated and turn into this fight. And I could experience the same experience coming up in me that had always come up before.
Mm-hmm.
But then this time, instead of trying to get away from it or trying to fix it or react to it, I actually just allowed it to be there. And as I was allowing myself to be with it, I was also aware of it. And it was quite remarkable. It was very painful at the time, but I was able to be with it. Now, what started to shift was as I was being with it, I spoke to him. I was able to speak to him a little bit differently.
Yes, from a different place.
From a different place.
It's not what you said, but where you were speaking from.
Yes, it was this. It's hard to explain it because that would be conceptual, but it was really just being present with it, with him and it in the moment. And where I was speaking from was being present in that moment with him. And then he responded differently. And then something started to unfold.
Yes.
In a very different way. And
yes,
it was quite surprising for me how a new possibility started to occur from that moment, from me being with what was moving in me.
Now, yes. Now, being with very often sounds to people like something passive. Oh, well, I can do that. I can just be with. But they don't really mean be with, they mean tolerate a little bit longer.
Yes.
And there is a world of difference, literally a world of difference between tolerating something and being with. First of all, being with is not passive. It is very active. It requires all of your ability to be present, which is an active measure. And without hope and without fear, to be present, that's a good, at least first understanding of what being with is. It's to be present to the circumstances without hope and without fear. Now, that sounds easy, but it's not. It requires a reorientation in where you're coming from. The character in the story is not capable of being present with the circumstances without hope and without fear, because hope and fear are what drive the story.
Yes. They're the final destinations, or
The
they're the
final destination and the concern that you won't get there.
yes. Yeah, I often get this with clients. They might have a moment in a session or in a retreat where they meet this experience that they've spent their whole life trying to get away from.
Right.
And literally they've created an entire life to get away from this experience. And
If I can just jump right in there, the entire life that people create is what's caught between what you're trying to get away from and what you're trying to get to.
yes.
And in both words, in both pictures, there's the trying to, which is the doing. And
Yes.
what people call having a life is that span of circumstances between what you're trying to get away from and what you're trying to get to. And that's what people call living, and it isn't. That's surviving.
Yes. And in these sessions or these moments when my clients will have these moments when they're being with the very thing that they've been trying to get away from, then they'll say to me, oh, so what do I do with this
Yes,
now?
exactly. Exactly. Which means they weren't being with it at all. They were
Yes.
just tolerating it until they could figure out what to do next.
Because it really just dismantles, like you said at the beginning, this whole culture of what we think it is to be a human being. We're here,
Exactly.
isn't it, to live this life, to get somewhere in ourselves and somewhere in life. But as we're trying to get to this somewhere, wherever that is, we're missing life.
Exactly. If I can jump in right there, you said something that gives me an opening. And that is that you brought up the culture of human being again, which I had referred to at the beginning. Um, in the 20 plus years that I traveled so much around the world, encountering people from so many different cultures around the world, I learned, I think, two major things. I learned a lot of things, but two things stand out. One is how different human beings are. I mean, when you're working with people in, let's say, India, I remember leading a program in Mumbai. India is not just another country. India is another planet. And what I mean by that is the culture is so fundamentally different than what we know in the West. The cultural assumptions, I mean, are so different that the way reality appears for people is so fundamentally different. So and you know, as I say, I encountered people in many from many different cultures, and having the privilege to really ask personal, intimate questions about, you know, how does things look inside the family, and what was your history as you grew up, and so on. And generally, when people pay for a program, more they're fairly likely to tell you the truth because they want the benefit. So and I really do consider it a privilege. I had the privilege of interacting with people from so many different cultures and being able to ask real questions and get, for the most part, I think, real answers. And so the first thing I learned is how different we human beings are. There's what, about 7.5 billion of us on the planet right now, approximately. How different we are. That's the first thing I learned. And you have to respect those differences. The second thing I learned is that when you go deep enough down into the roots and the sources of the story, how similar we are. Not only how similar, we are the same. So, for example, if I can continue there, one of the things that is an obvious similarity of all members of our species is every single person I ever interacted with had a me. Now, that sounds silly when I say it so bluntly, but think about it for a second. That every person that I ever dealt with in those many years, and I dealt with lots of people, there was this me who was the main character of their story who was living their story. And they were dealing with repeating patterns. And so I began to see that there's a kind of a structure or a design to the way that we human beings live in life and encounter life and deal with life.
Mhm.
And what drives our relationship to life derives from the fact that we've identified with this me, trying to get away from something and trying to get towards something, the hope and the fear.
Yes.
So, so that is the kind of, let's call it ontological anthropology, to coin a term, the kind of the anthropology or the cultural examination of what it is to be a human being.
Mm. So I have a bigger question,
Even bigger.
even bigger. You know, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, which I'm sure you will. I believe that we come into this world and, you know, in a not in a character, not in a me. When we arrive into this world, we have a sense of real presence and connectedness to life and to the moment and to the now. Certainly, I have witnessed that in my children. What then creates this split when we
Yes.
go from this space of real presence and consciousness to this character, to the
Yes.
surviving? What creates that? Why does that happen and what creates it?
Well, you're asking a really, really important question. And a lot of people have asked that question. And as far as I know, there's no real consensus about an answer to that question, but there's a lot of speculation about it. Uh, so let me answer that in the best way I can in several ways. First of all, you got to be careful not to romanticize early childhood. Yes, children definitely are much more present to life than the way we live when we get older. No, no question about that. They're much more present, but they haven't yet matured to another way of being. Now, a lot of people have asked the question, is this a dead end? Winding up as a character in a story, did nature make some kind of a mistake and we're in some kind of a dead end? And, there's a lot of speculation about that. Um, Here's where I am about it. And by no means do I think I have the right answer, but this is how I see it. Um, in the beginning, child development experts call the first stages of life the Ouroboros. It's a kind of an undifferentiated soup of experience. It's a soup of undifferentiated experience. Solid objects have not yet gelled into a me and a you. It's just a undifferentiated soup of experience. And then one day, and here's where the speculation begins, for whatever reasons, and I've got my theories and other people have theirs, one day something happens and a me begins to appear as somehow separate from all the rest. And that from that day on, there's a me, and then there's life. And then there is this learning how this me can deal with it. There's me and it and learning how to deal with it. And a lot of one's education as a human being is learning how to navigate that divide between me
Yes,
and it. And the it
yes,
includes not only the world, but all the other me's in the world.
yes.
And then let's see, how shall I say it? At some point, you get to what most people call being an adult. And
Yes.
being an adult is I'm going to simplify here, is basically having learned how to maneuver in a socially acceptable way in in this divide between me and it, including all the other me's. And that's where human development appears to end, that you're relatively logical and rational, that you know how to control most of your emotional impulses, that you have a relatively stable image of yourself, and that you've learned some of the basic rules of your society's sense of manners. And that's what people call adulthood. And the whole premise of the work that I do and that you do is, does it really stop there? Or is it possible to continue the maturation process beyond what people call being an adult?
Yes.
And of course, I think yes. And that is the nature of the work we do, which is developing a different relationship to the story. That's the breakout. That's the get out of jail. That's where it begins. That's not where it ends, but that's where it begins.
Mhm.
Now, to come back to your question, um, is it better to have to somehow remain like remain in this childlike innocence? Well, I don't think so. I think there's a pre-egoic state, which we call childhood, but there's also a post-egoic state, which I call, well, we don't have a
Maturity.
name for it, but it comes after you mature the next step. And life did not make a mistake. We need to go through this ego phase, this character in the story phase, to come out the other side. And who knows how many generations that takes before a critical mass of people have done that. But we need to do that to have a different relationship to life, which I believe life has an interest in having.
Yes.
Now, all of that's speculation, but that's my speculation.
Yes. It makes me sort of reflect back on my own life and my own story. The moment for me, I remember, or I have some memory of us. You've spoken to me about how human beings are storytelling animals. I have a memory of a moment in childhood where, my mother was unavailable, and therefore I told myself, oh, I am not lovable. And I started to
Right.
identify with this, I am a not lovable person. I am a
Right.
not lovable. And when I look back on my past, my whole life was built around this I am not lovable character.
And every person has one of those moments. And that's
Yes.
part of the work we do. It's not the moment itself, and it's unavoidable. I've never met a human being that did not have one of those moments. And it doesn't necessarily come from having had a terribly traumatic experience. It could be something really quite trivial. It's
Yes.
just a little momentary interruption in the flow of things is
Yeah.
sufficient for a human consciousness as a child to latch on to something like, oh, that must mean that I'm not lovable. And
Yes.
that's the kernel from which the story is then generated.
Yes. And it's not, like you said, it's not even necessarily what happened on the outside. It's
Right.
what we tell ourselves. I had this remarkable moment quite a few years ago when I lost a baby, and my daughter was only three and a half at the time, and I was going through a few days or even a few weeks of grieving, and I was resting a lot. And one night my husband went to read her a story to put her to bed, and she said to my husband, Daddy, why is it that mummy doesn't love me anymore? And it was so profound to hear the story that she had told herself
Already.
already of
Yes.
what was happening
Yes.
versus what was actually happening.
Exactly. And from that point on, life is about gathering evidence that your point of view is correct and then trying to escape the consequences of what you assume to be true.
Yes. So when we look at the work that we do, the moment of coming back to the theme of living beyond the story, the moment of even first being able to have that, like you said, on the bike with the balance
Yeah.
of the seeing,
A shift in the way the world appears.
of the seeing where we've been coming from all this time.
Right. Right.
That it doesn't matter what I keep changing out there.
What I
I
do.
what I do, I continue to see myself and the world around me as proof that I am not enough.
Yes, the way the world appears confirms the assumption about the way I am.
Yes.
In other words, who I am being.
Yes, and that brings me to another big question. I speak about it a lot, coming home to being, coming
Yes,
home who we truly are.
yes,
This work is not about becoming someone else.
yes.
It's
A
not about,
better version of who you thought you were.
everyone's trying to be a better version of who they were last month or who they were last year.
Yes,
It's not because that all continues to happen inside the story.
exactly. Exactly.
So, but coming home, I
Yes,
love the word home. Coming home to being is beyond this story.
exactly. So, what you're pointing to very poignantly is the apparent contradiction between working on oneself to get somewhere and where you get to after you've worked on yourself seems to be where you were all along but didn't know it,
Hmm. Yes.
or which is why it feels like you're remembering something or coming home to. There's a famous Sufi story. I think many people have heard it already. There's this man um, crawling around on hands and knees underneath a street light. It's evening time, and this man is underneath the street light, and he's on his hands and knees, and he's looking for something. And a second man comes walking by, and he looks at the first man. And he says, "Well, what are you looking for, sir?" And the first man says, "Well, I dropped my house keys, and I'm looking for them. I don't know, I'm looking for my house keys." And the second man says, "Well, I'll help you look." And he gets down on his hands and knees, and he's looking all around. And after a good 20, 30 minutes, the second man says to the first one, "Are you sure you dropped them here? Because we can't find them." And he said, "Oh, no, no, I didn't drop them here, but there's more light here." So, we're looking in the places where there's so-called more light. In other words, where we're familiar. We're looking in the light of the story for what we think we've lost.
Yes.
And you can't find them there because that's not where it is, but there's more light there.
Yes. This reminds me so much of what happened for me or occurred for me very recently, and a lot of people know this, of what I call the death of the warrior woman. I created my entire brand
Yes,
on not only being the warrior woman, but teaching others how to be a warrior woman.
yes,
And I even got signed to write a book called Warrior Woman.
right.
I'd spent my life building this
Bigger
belief,
and better, bigger and better me.
the bigger and better me. If I could just be this warrior woman,
Yes,
then everything's going to be all right.
exactly.
And and oh, I had this massive moment of seeing last year when I saw that the whole thing was a character that I was identified with to get away from the I'm not enough.
Yes, exactly.
Fix the I'm not enough. And as soon as the moment of really seeing it was really the moment for me, it was the moment it started to lose power.
That's the beginning of being able to be with. You have to see
Yes.
the story as a story. You have to see the circumstances as circumstances, not as reality, but as
Yes.
circumstances of a story. That's the beginning of being able to be with. And being able to be with is the beginning of having a different relationship to the circumstances.
Yes, and as long as I was trying to overcompensate for the I'm not enough inside, I was never really going to get what I really wanted, which
Yes.
was to live a certain state of peace and freedom and presence in life. And
There's a famous guy, he's often called the longshoreman philosopher, Eric Hoffer. He wrote a book many, many years ago. And in the book, he says something very good. He says, "You can't ever get enough of what you don't really want, but you keep trying harder."
yeah, and God, did I try hard, and it was exhausting, but
Yes.
it's a very painful moment, actually, to see that, you know, you spend 40 years trying to get somewhere without getting anywhere, and that there's nowhere to get to.
That's the hard part.
But actually, I must say, it has been a real moment of liberation for me to let that warrior woman, or to let that need to be the warrior woman, dissolve, because there really wasn't anything really rich there for me. It just felt like continuously, like you said, surviving.
Yes.
um yeah, it's a very humble moment in life, actually.
Coming home, when you
Yes.
really do come home, is very humbling. It's very humbling because it's humble to be in the presence of who you are, as opposed to who you thought you were or who you thought you should be.
Yes. Yeah, the more I do this work, and I'm lucky enough to witness other human beings grow through this process, I keep coming back to the same thing. I'm just becoming more me than I ever was before. And it's like, oh, it just feels like me, even though it's not the me of the character.
Yes, and that's why people often make the distinction between me and self, just to have a vocabulary that can deal with these issues. So it's a kind of coming home to self,
Yes.
as opposed to the character called me.
Yes, and actually what the gifts are that come from this is that the more I come home to being and out of the character, it impacts and feeds every aspect of my life. It's, my
Yes,
marriage has transformed.
yes,
Everyone knows I got remarried, and it is allowed a new possibility in that. And I'm writing a new book. The relationships I have with my friends, because it wasn't anything about changing friends, changing the partner, changing the job. It was about where I was coming from.
exactly.
Yeah. And
And where one comes from determines the way the world appears, and then your action is correlated with the appearing of the world.
yes. Oh, I always come back to this quote by Buddha. I use it in my book. It's pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And we live in a way that we're trying to get away from the pain, but by doing that, we create all this suffering.
Yes,
And actually, by being with the very thing that we think will kill us or break us, is actually the very thing that brings life. It's to be alive is to be present with life.
yes,
Uh, that is certainly my experience, and it it's there's a richness that comes with that, and a beauty that comes with that I certainly couldn't find before.
yes. You spoke about Buddha. Let me, if I may, throw in something there. For a while, years ago, I was involved with Vipassana meditation, which I found very valuable. And something that I learned there was that Buddha, although is mostly seen as a religious figure, he was actually a scientist. He studied the human condition as a scientist would, so to speak. He was a scientist of the culture of human being. You could say he was one of the earliest ontological anthropologists. I'm using that loosely here, but and what he communicated to people, what he learned in his scientific investigation, was that it is not. You don't have to live the rest of your life in the way of being given by a me, which inevitably leads to suffering. That's the optional.
Yes.
Yes, there is pain,
Yes.
but it doesn't have to lead to suffering. It can lead to freedom. That was
Yes.
his message.
Yes. I've had many moments of being with pain and being with fear that have almost moved into beauty and
Yes.
love.
Yes.
Same moment, and it's always surprised me.
Somebody once said life is either um, um, a torture chamber or a school. And you have the choice of which it is. If it's a school, well, then the pain serves learning,
Yes.
and not learning just conceptually, although it may begin there to understand one situation, but learning being.
Yes. Yes. And I have one last question that I know that people will be very interested in. I think there is this misconception that if we do enough work, if we mature enough,
Yeah.
then we will be able to live without a story. That
Yes.
we'll be in this space of being and liberation and freedom constantly, and then we don't have to deal with the story again. And then of course it comes back. I mean, I always say this at
Right.
the end of my retreats: wherever you are now, enjoy it, but the story's going to come back.
Yes, the story's going to come back because it never left.
Yes.
Remember, the story, the question is not whether you're in the story or not. You're always in the story because, as I said before, there's nothing else. That's the world, that's the life that you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not whether you getting beyond the story, living beyond the story is not getting outside or no longer having a story.
Yes.
It's altering your relationship to the story so that you have a story rather than being trapped in one.
Yes.
Now, one more thing, if I may. This illusion, which is very attractive to people, like, it's because they take maturation and they try to squeeze it into their story. Oh, if I just mature enough, then I'll have my happy ending. So but that misses the whole point. Then you're still right back in the same old relationship to your story, which is being a character, hoping to one day be a mature character in your story.
Yes.
Um, so it's about you can't the idea that one day you're going to get free of me and story is naive.
Yes.
And but rather than that, to understand, and this is complex and is a hallmark of the kind of maturation that I say is possible, is you never stop being your character because you need a body and a mind in order to play the game of life. You cannot play the game of life, which we call reality, without a mind, without a me and a story,
Mm-hmm.
without a mind and a body.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's not all you are.
Yes.
And if you're only that, if you know yourself as only that, if that's the only way of being, you know yourself, then you're not living, you're surviving. But if
Yes.
you know that that's who you are and that's all you can be, but that's not all you are, simultaneously, and the key word is simultaneously, you are that and you are not that.
Yes.
And if you can be the character in the story at the same time that you're able to be in the presence of it's just the character in a story simultaneously, then you have a totally different relationship to your life, which
Yes.
has nothing at all to do with this romantic illusion of one day getting free of your story and getting free of me.
Yes. Yes. And I certainly have experienced that myself. I shared a little bit on Instagram just before this interview about a moment a few years ago when I stood up in one of your programs and I declared what my vision was for my life. I envisioned this being a space for maturation, authenticity, and love. And you said to me, if you are really willing to commit to that vision, are you prepared to meet multiple versions of your scary mother? And, and at the time, I said yes, but I really didn't know what you meant. And, you know, I shared before, like I said before this interview, that my life occurs very, very differently today. And I am fulfilling that vision. I'm able to show up in a certain presence with life. But that story doesn't hasn't disappeared. I do still meet multiple versions of my scary mother.
Right.
I have those repeated reactivation moments from
Right.
the story, but it almost has become, like you say, you've said in programs before, it becomes like a fan in the background.
A radio in the next room, which distracts you at first, but after a while, it recedes from your awareness. It's still playing, but it no longer distracts you from being present to whatever's there.
Yes. And really, that is my experience of freedom.
Yes.
Because I say this a lot, it's not about feeling better, it's about being free.
Yes, but it's hard for people to get that because it
Yes.
seems like feeling better is freedom.
Yes.
And it doesn't exclude feeling better because you do feel better when you're free, but that wasn't the point. It's just a side benefit, if you will.
Yes. Thank you very much, David. This has been really, really a rich and very powerful conversation. And I really thank you for your teachings, constantly teaching me, so I can pass this on. I know that people watching this will find this very, very thought-provoking and very useful for them. So I want to thank you so much for giving us your time today, and sharing so much wisdom with us.
Well, you're very welcome. Let me just say, I've had my teachers, and they've contributed to me and helped me learn. And passing it on is just the way it is. That's what you do.
Yes.
And the other thing I want to say is it's always interesting and fun to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I do just want to finish just on that note, as I step out of, or as I step away from needing to be the warrior woman, one thing I am learning more and more is how rich and humbling it is to continue to allow myself to be a student and to learn from teachers. And that really, it was never really about the me. And it's so, it's so rich to be able to learn from teachers and then to pass it on, and to keep learning. And like you said, for life to be an education rather than a torture chamber.
You're either learning or you're suffering.
Yes. So thank you very, very much. And I'm really excited to share this with everyone. Thank you.